The sterile hum of the alien lab was broken only by the faint hiss of hydraulics and the occasional murmurs of the technicians. Standing at the center of the room, encased in a capsule frosted with a thin layer of cryogenic mist, was a figure that seemed almost mythic. The humanoid body within was covered in a faint shimmer of frost, its features angular and muscular, a perfect blend of strength and precision. To the aliens who surrounded the chamber, this was no ordinary specimen. It was a relic from a bygone era, a legend of human resilience and destruction. The lead scientist, a tall being with elongated limbs and a translucent exoskeleton, tapped on the control panel with a mix of apprehension and fascination. "Are we certain this is wise?" it asked, its voice reverberating with an odd clicking cadence. The human archives spoke of their soldiers as uncontrollable. A smaller technician with iridescent scales responded. The council approved the revival. "This is the only chance we have. If what the records say is true, this human possesses skills far beyond anything we've encountered. They could be the key to turning the tide." The room grew tense as the revival sequence began. Lights on the control panels flickered, and the hiss of gas escaping the chamber intensified. Inside the cryopod, the figure stirred slightly, the faintest twitch of a finger sending a ripple of unease through the alien observers. The lead scientist's mandibles clicked together nervously. The data also suggests they were dangerous to their own kind. "If their aggression cannot be controlled, then we'll deal with it," interrupted the commander, stepping into the room. Its armor gleamed under the bright lab lights, a sharp contrast to the anxiety etched into its posture. "We need every advantage we can get. The enemy has already breached 3 of our colonies. If this human is as formidable as the legends claim, then it's worth the risk." The last of the mist cleared from the pod, revealing the human's face fully for the first time. It was pale, unnervingly calm, but the faint scars lining their cheekbones and forehead hinted at a life steeped in conflict. The commander tilted its head, studying the figure. "This is what humans considered their apex warrior." The scientist nodded. Enhanced reflexes, unmatched combat instincts, and a near-impervious mental state. But there's a catch. Their psychological stability deteriorated over prolonged missions. They were designed to win wars, not to coexist. The commander clicked its mandibles thoughtfully. "We don't need coexistence. We need victory." The final sequence initiated with a low, rumbling hum. The human's chest rose sharply as the cryo sleep systems disengaged. Their eyes snapped open, and the room seemed to freeze. The gaze that met the aliens was sharp, calculating, and void of fear. The human took a slow, measured breath, then sat up, the movement fluid and deliberate, as though they had never been asleep. The aliens stepped back instinctively, their towering forms dwarfed by the raw intensity radiating from the awakened figure. The humans swung their legs over the edge of the pod, their bare feet touching the cold floor. They looked around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with a clinical precision that was almost machine-like. "Where am I?" the human asked, their voice steady, but carrying an edge that cut through the air like a blade. Their gaze locked onto the commander, who stood rooted to the spot. "You are aboard the Zinthar Coalition ship, Ecliptic Resolve," the commander replied, its voice firm but not unkind. "We revived you because we need your help." The human raised an eyebrow, their expression unreadable. "Help? With what?" The scientist stepped forward cautiously. "Our species is at war. The enemy is relentless, and we are on the verge of annihilation. According to the archives, humans like you were specialists in situations like these. We need your expertise." The humans stood, their movement unsettlingly graceful, and began to stretch, testing the limits of their muscles and joints as if they were shaking off centuries of disuse. "You pulled me out of Cryo for a war," they said, more to themselves than the aliens. "Typical." The commander stepped closer, emboldened by the humans' apparent calm. "We believe you can turn the tide. Your abilities are unparalleled." "Abilities," the human interrupted, a hint of bitterness creeping into their tone. "You mean my ability to kill?" The room fell silent. The aliens exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. The humans smirked faintly, their eyes narrowing as they surveyed the group. "Let me guess. You read about the unstoppable super soldiers in your little archives, and you thought, why not wake one up and throw them into the fire?" The scientist hesitated. We had no other choice." The human tilted their head, their expression softening into something almost amused. "No choice. That's what they always say." Before anyone could respond, the ship's alarms blared, a piercing sound that sent the aliens into a frenzy of movement. The commander activated its communicator, its tone urgent. "Report. Enemy vessels have entered the sector," came the reply. "They're targeting our engines." The commander cursed in its native tongue, turning to the human. "If you're as capable as the archives suggest, now's the time to prove it." The human glanced at the door, then back at the aliens. "You really woke me up just in time for a fight." They cracked their knuckles, a grim smile spreading across their face. "Fine. Let's see what I've still got." As they followed the commander out of the lab, the humans' movements became sharper, more purposeful. Their demeanor shifted, the casual sarcasm replaced with a laser-like focus. The ship shuddered under enemy fire, but the humans seemed unfazed, their eyes scanning every corridor, every detail. When they reached the armory, the human wasted no time. They moved through the racks of weapons, selecting one with practiced ease. The aliens watched in awe as they strapped on armor that had been designed for their kind, but seemed to fit the human perfectly. "You're awfully calm for someone who just woke up," the commander observed, trying to mask its unease. The human shrugged. "This isn't my first war." As the human prepared to head to the battlefield, a technician approached hesitantly. "We've uploaded the tactical data to your visor. It should help." "Save it," the human said, cutting them off. "I don't need maps. Just point me at the enemy." The technicians stepped back, their scales flushing with embarrassment. The commander motioned toward the nearest transport bay. "The enemy's main boarding party is targeting our core systems. If they breach them—" "They won't," the human interrupted, their tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay here and keep your people safe." Without waiting for a response, the human marched toward the transport bay, their weapons slung over their shoulder. The aliens watched in stunned silence as the doors closed behind them, sealing the human inside. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the scientist broke the silence. "Do you think we've made a mistake?" The commander didn't answer immediately, their eyes fixed on the sealed doors. "That depends," they said finally, "on whether we've unleashed a savior or something far worse." The transport bay doors opened, and the humans stepped into the chaos of the battlefield. The air crackled with energy blasts, and the ground shook with the impact of explosions. But the human didn't hesitate. They moved with a precision and ferocity that left the enemy stunned, their presence a whirlwind of destruction and raw power. And as the aliens watched the security feeds from the safety of the ship, a chilling thought began to take root. They had revived a weapon, one they might not be able to control. The battlefield was a sprawling mess of chaos, illuminated by the flashes of alien weaponry and the flickering glow of shield systems straining against the onslaught. The human moved like a shadow given form, slipping through cover and debris with a precision that defied logic. Every movement was calculated, every shot deliberate. To the enemy, they were a phantom figure that appeared and disappeared before they could react, leaving only destruction in their wake. Back aboard the Ecliptic Resolve, the command center was a hive of activity. The commander stood rigidly in front of a tactical display, watching the live feed from the battlefield. The humans' movements were being tracked by a hovering reconnaissance drone, but even its advanced systems struggled to keep up. Around the room, technicians and officers exchanged nervous glances as they watched the human take down wave after wave of enemy forces. There was no hesitation, no fear, only a methodical efficiency that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Reports indicate the enemy is retreating from the core systems, a technician announced, their voice tinged with disbelief. They're regrouping to reinforce their positions near the outer hull. The commander nodded, their mandibles clicking thoughtfully. What about the human? Are they holding their position? The technician hesitated, then shook their head. No, they're advancing. Alone. The room fell silent. The scientist who had overseen the revival spoke up, their voice tight with concern. They weren't given orders to advance. Why would they? They don't need orders, the commander interrupted, their tone grim. Humans like them were trained to act independently, to adapt to the battlefield in real time. It's what made them so effective and so dangerous. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the human pressed forward, weaving through the enemy ranks like a storm cutting through a forest. The enemy forces were clearly unprepared for this kind of assault. Their tactics relied on overwhelming numbers and brute force, but against the human, it was useless. Every squad sent to intercept them was dismantled in seconds, their formations shattered before they could even react. But as the human pushed deeper into enemy territory, they began to notice something strange. The enemy's movements were becoming more coordinated, their attacks more deliberate. It was as if they were being herded, guided toward a specific location. The realization made the human pause, their instincts screaming that something wasn't right. Back on the ship, the scientist leaned over a console, analyzing the data coming in from the drone. Look at this, they said, pointing to the screen. The enemy isn't just retreating, they're repositioning. They're trying to lure the human into a trap. The commander's mandibles clicked in frustration. Can we warn them? Send a message through the drone? The technician shook their head. The interference from the enemy's jamming systems is too strong. We can't get a signal through. The scientist frowned. Then we need to pull them back. If they keep advancing, they'll be outnumbered and surrounded. The commander's gaze hardened. Do you think they'll listen to us, even if we could reach them? This human isn't like us. They don't follow orders. They follow instincts. On the battlefield, the human came to a stop at the entrance to a massive structure. It was a strange, otherworldly design, its walls pulsing faintly with an eerie bioluminescent glow. The air around it felt heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that set their teeth on edge. This wasn't just an enemy outpost, it was something far more significant. The human crouched behind a piece of cover, scanning the area. Their visor highlighted several enemy patrols nearby, but none were making any moves toward them. It was as if they were being ignored. The thought made their stomach churn. No one ignored a threat, unless they had a reason to believe it wasn't a threat at all. Their communicator crackled faintly, but the words were garbled beyond recognition. They tapped the device, trying to clear the signal, but it was no use. They were on their own. Taking a deep breath, the human moved toward the structure, their steps careful and deliberate. The closer they got, the stronger the strange energy became. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that seemed to resonate with the very core of their being. They clenched their jaw, forcing themselves to stay focused. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop them. Inside the command center, the tension was palpable. The scientists paced back and forth, their elongated limbs twitching with nervous energy. "They've entered the structure," they said, their voice barely above a whisper. "We have no data on what's inside." They could be walking straight into a death trap. The commander didn't respond. Their eyes were fixed on the tactical display, watching as the human signal moved deeper into the unknown. For the first time since this mission began, they felt a pang of doubt. Had they made a mistake? Had they underestimated the risks of reviving this human? The human moved through the structure's dimly lit corridors, their weapon held at the ready. The walls seemed to pulse, faintly with each step, as if the entire building were alive. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the strange energy, it was the silence. No enemies, no sounds, just an unbroken void that seemed to press down on them from all sides. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a massive chamber. At its center was a towering structure, a spire of black and silver that seemed to hum with power. Around it were rows of alien machinery, their purposes unknown but unmistakably sinister. And standing around the spire, their forms bathed in its eerie glow, were the enemy commanders. The human froze, their mind racing. This was it. This was why they had been revived, why they had been sent into the fray. But as they studied the scene, a chilling realization dawned on them. The enemy commanders weren't preparing for an attack, they were waiting. And their eyes, those cold, alien eyes, were fixed directly on the human. Back on the ship, the commanders slammed their fist against the console. "They found the enemy command center," they growled. "If they can take out those leaders, we might have a chance to end this war." The scientists shook their head. "But at what cost? If they fail, we'll lose our only advantage." The commander didn't respond. They knew the stakes as well as anyone. All they could do now was watch and hope that the gamble they had taken wasn't about to backfire spectacularly. In the chamber, the human tightened their grip on their weapon, their body coiled like a spring. This was it, the moment they had been trained for, the moment they had been born for. And as the enemy commanders began to move, their intentions clear, the human felt a grim smile tug at the corners of their mouth. "Let's see what you've got," they muttered, their voice a low growl. And then, with a surge of raw, unrelenting determination, they charged. The human moved through the darkened chamber, each step deliberate, every sense heightened. The alien commanders stood like statues, their expressions unreadable, but their presence was overwhelming. They weren't just waiting, they were preparing. The humming spire in the center of the room sent vibrations through the human's bones, its energy now palpable, almost suffocating. It was a power like nothing they had ever felt before, and they knew that this was the moment that would define everything. The enemy commanders made no move to attack. Instead, they slowly raised their hands in unison, their fingers stretching toward the spire as though performing some kind of ritual. The air seemed to shift, a low rumble echoing in the chamber as the room's temperature fluctuated. The humans' instincts screamed to act, to strike before they could complete whatever it was they were doing. But they stayed still, their breath steady, watching, waiting. There was no mistaking the intention now. The alien commanders were trying to harness the power of the spire, something ancient, something dangerous. The energy in the room surged, causing the walls to glow with a sickly light. The human's mind raced, every nerve in their body screaming at them to move, to end it all. But they needed to know more. This was bigger than a simple tactical victory. This was the heart of the war. In the command center aboard the Ecliptic Resolve, the tension was unbearable. The crew, once full of confidence in their human asset, were now paralyzed with uncertainty. The human had been moving through the enemy's defenses with terrifying ease, but now they were facing something far more insidious, a force that not only controlled the battlefield, but threatened the fabric of the very war itself. Was this why they had been revived? To face this unknown? The scientists' eyes darted across the tactical readouts, their mind racing. They can't be attempting to control the spire. It's too dangerous. It's not just a weapon, it's a source of power. And if they're tapping into it, they could. They'll destroy everything, the commander finished for them, their voice tight with urgency. They knew the stakes. This was not about victory anymore. It was about survival. The human felt the tension in the air shift. Something was happening, something they could feel deep in their core. The alien commander's ritual had reached its apex, and the spire hummed louder, its glow blinding. It was as if the entire chamber had come alive, vibrating with energy. The human's heart pounded in their chest as they knew what had to come next. This was no longer a battle of tactics. It was a race against time. Their eyes scanned the room, pinpointing the alien leaders who stood motionless, seemingly lost in their trance. In that instant, the human understood something that had eluded them up until now. These alien commanders were not in control. The spire was controlling them. It was manipulating them, drawing them into a power they couldn't fully comprehend. The human's hands tightened around their weapon, ready to strike. But then, the ground beneath them trembled. The entire chamber shook as if the spire itself had come alive. The light intensified, flickering in violent pulses, blinding the human momentarily. They staggered backward, instincts taking over, diving for cover as the force of the energy field exploded outward. In that moment, they realized something far more horrifying. The spire wasn't just controlling the alien commanders, it was controlling everything. The room, the air, the very atmosphere itself. The power it unleashed was beyond anything the human had faced, and they could feel it seeping into their body, trying to take hold, to bind them to its will. But the human had been bred for this moment. They had been trained to withstand anything, to fight through the impossible. This wasn't fear. It was resolve. Through the haze of light and energy, the human could see the alien commanders begin to collapse. They struggled to maintain their focus, their hands twitching as if trying to tear themselves away from the spire's influence. But it was too late. The ritual had gone too far. The human gritted their teeth, their mind made up. There was no more room for hesitation. They couldn't allow this power to remain in the hands of the enemy. With a surge of speed, they shot out from their cover, moving with a deadly grace toward the spire. Every muscle screamed with effort as they ran, the air thick with crackling energy, the ground shaking beneath their feet. Time seemed to slow, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The alien commanders, now writhing on the ground, looked up at the human with eyes full of fear and desperation. Their attempt to harness the spire had failed. They were no longer in control, but the human had no time for mercy. They knew that even in their broken state, these aliens were still a threat, and if they didn't act now, everything would be lost. They reached the spire, their hands gripping its cold, slick surface. The power thrummed beneath their fingertips, sending shockwaves through their body. The energy fought them, resisted them, but the human held firm. They couldn't give in. They had to take control. It wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future. The spire's energy pulsed faster, stronger, as if recognizing the human's defiance. The entire structure began to hum louder, shaking with a force that sent cracks through the walls of the chamber. The human pushed harder, their bodies straining against the power that sought to overwhelm them. Every part of their being screamed in pain, but they refused to back down. The alien commanders, now fully broken, staggered to their feet, their eyes wide with horror. They had underestimated the human. They had thought they could control them, bend them to their will. But the human was no tool to be used. They were a force of nature, and now that force was about to change the course of everything. In the command center, the crew watched in stunned silence. They could see the human signal growing stronger, the spire's energy fluctuating with every passing second. The commander's eyes narrowed in focus. This was it. The moment of truth. With one final, unrelenting push, the human broke through the spire's defenses, their hands enveloped in a blinding light. The room erupted in a deafening roar, the energy inside the spire reaching a boiling point. The human's form was lost in the blinding explosion of light. Then, silence. The power was gone. The hum of the spire stopped. The alien commanders lay motionless on the ground, their bodies still, their control shattered. The human, though, was nowhere to be seen. In the command center, the technician's voice broke through the stillness. We've lost contact. The human signal. It's gone. The commander's eyes locked onto the empty screen. Their face remained unreadable, but in their heart, something stirred. They didn't know what had happened to the human, but they knew one thing for certain. The battle had been won, and whatever came next, they would face it together, human and alien, enemies turned allies, united by the storm they had unleashed. Just as the command center fell into a heavy silence, the technician's voice suddenly trembled, cutting through the thick air. The signal. It's back. It's faint, but it's there. The commander's eyes snapped to the screen, heart skipping a beat. The thought of the human being lost to the spire, consumed by its power, had weighed heavily on them. But now, a small glimmer of hope, perhaps too small, flickered in the corner of their vision. The technician's fingers danced across the console, their eyes locked on the readouts. This doesn't make sense, they muttered under their breath. The signal was there, but it wasn't coming from the human. It was coming from the spire itself, or more precisely, from where the human had stood moments before. The commander stood up, unable to suppress the unease crawling up their spine. "What are you saying?" Their voice was tight with apprehension. The technician hesitated for a moment, then quickly relayed their findings. It's as if the human's energy has merged with the spire. It's like they've become a part of it, one with it. They looked up from the console, their face a mixture of disbelief and fear. We thought the human was gone, but what if? What if they'd become something else? The room was still, the weight of that possibility pressing down on every individual present. The human had always been an anomaly, a force that defied all expectations. But this was something no one could have predicted. If the human had somehow fused with the very thing they had tried to destroy, if they had become one with the power that had been driving the alien commanders to madness, the implications were staggering. The alien commanders, still recovering from their failed ritual, stared at the screens in confusion. They had no answer to the new development, no understanding of what this might mean. Their world, once so firmly in their grasp, was slipping away, and they could feel the shift in the air. The human had been a weapon, a force to be controlled, yet somehow it seemed as though the human was the one in control now. They were no longer just a soldier. They had become something more, something unimaginable. Across the darkened chamber, where the spire once hummed with unrestrained power, a strange calm had taken root. The air felt heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The alien commanders, still on the ground and barely recovering from their ordeal, began to realize the full extent of what had just occurred. One of them, a high-ranking leader, slowly pushed themselves to their feet. Their eyes widened in disbelief as they turned their gaze toward the spire. It's alive," they whispered, the terror in their voice impossible to mask. "It's not just the spire anymore. It's them." The air in the room seemed to warp, distorting as if the very fabric of reality was bending. The commander took a step forward, but their movement was slow, unnatural, as if their body were being held back by an invisible force. It was then that they realized what they had thought was power, an instrument of control, was something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. From deep within the core of the spire, a pulse of energy shot through the room. The light brightened to a blinding intensity, forcing the alien commanders to shield their eyes. But the power was not hostile, not yet. It was a presence, a voice that only they could hear, echoing inside their minds. The message was clear, yet impossible to comprehend. "You were never meant to control me. You were never meant to control them." It was the human's voice, but it was different, altered, as if the very fabric of their existence had been rewritten. It was like the human had transcended their physical form, becoming something more than human, more than alien, a fusion of both. The alien commanders recoiled, their minds struggling to process what was happening. It felt as though the human was speaking not just to them, but to the universe itself. In the command center, the crew watched in disbelief as the spire pulsed with a rhythm they could now feel in their bones. The technician typed frantically at the console, trying to pinpoint the exact source of the signal. "The human is... They're speaking through the spire. They're sending a message to all of us. It's like they've taken control of the network." The commander's hands tightened on the console, their eyes narrowing. The stakes had escalated beyond anything they had imagined. The human was no longer a mere soldier. They were a living conduit of power, a bridge between their world and something far greater, far more dangerous. "We need to stop this," the commander said, their voice hard with resolve, "before it's too late." But even as they spoke, they could feel the pull of the spire's energy, the temptation to understand what had happened, to try and use it for themselves. The room seemed to warp around them, and for a moment, it felt as though they were no longer in control, but merely passengers on a ride to an uncertain destination. The alien commanders, still struggling to make sense of the situation, began to stir. They understood now what the human had done. They had not simply stopped them. They had rewritten the rules of the war. The spire, once a source of boundless power, was now a conduit for something far beyond their understanding. The human had become its master. But there was a catch. The alien leaders had underestimated the humans' will, their capacity for adaptation. They had thought the human would be a mere tool or weapon to use as they pleased. But they hadn't accounted for the human's true potential, the ability to shape the very forces that controlled the universe itself. It was then that a new realization hit the alien commanders like a shockwave. The human wasn't just a weapon. They were something more, something no alien technology, no ancient force had ever accounted for. Something that could reshape everything. They had made a mistake by reviving the human because, in doing so, they had unleashed a force that could never be contained again. As the tension in the command center reached its breaking point, the technician turned to the commander with wide, terrified eyes. "We can't stop this. The human. They've already begun to rewrite the system." The commander stared at the screen, realizing the truth too late. The war was no longer about power or control. It was about survival on a scale they could never have predicted. And then, just as the full weight of the realization sank in, the spire had begun to hum again, but this time it was different. The power no longer pulsed from it. It radiated outward, covering the entire battlefield, stretching far beyond the walls of the alien ship. The air was thick with energy, pure, raw, unstoppable. The human had not just been revived. They had become the embodiment of something far more powerful than anyone had ever imagined. The darkness hung in the air like a heavy shroud, and the only sound in the command center was the low hum of the spire's energy, now more alive than ever. The alien commanders stood frozen, the realization settling over them like a cold weight. The human was no longer a soldier. They had become something incomprehensible, something beyond their control. But the most terrifying part was that they didn't know what this new power meant for them, for their future, or for their entire species. The spire pulsated again, a low, vibrating hum that filled the room with raw, untamed power. It felt as though the very air was bending to the will of the human. The alien commanders could sense it a shift. They had always believed that they were the masters of this battlefield, that they controlled everything. But now, they were at the mercy of a force they couldn't even begin to understand. The technician was still typing frantically at the console, trying to make sense of the data flashing across the screen. Their face was pale, eyes wide with panic. It's like the human has hacked into the very fabric of our technology. They've overridden everything. The commander, still struggling to stay composed, watched the technician's frantic movements with growing dread. The human had become something far worse than any weapon they could have imagined, a force that was rewriting their reality, not just as soldiers, but as individuals, as an entire species. And then the voice came again. Not from the spire, not from the speakers, but from inside their minds. It was the human, their voice both distant and close, echoing in their consciousness. "You thought you could control me. You thought you could control this power. But you were wrong." The words were chilling. The human was speaking to them, but not in any way they had experienced before. The human's consciousness, or whatever they had become, was no longer bound by the limitations of their body. It was everywhere. It was in the air, in the spire, in the very pulse of the universe. The commanders could feel it seeping into their minds, taking root in their thoughts, and it was impossible to block out. A sudden jolt shot through the room, the temperature fluctuating rapidly as if the very atmosphere had been altered. The ground beneath them trembled, the walls vibrating as if they too were part of this larger force. "We have to do something," the technician said urgently, looking up at the commander. We have to stop it before it's too late." The commander nodded grimly, but even as they spoke, they knew it was already too late. The power had already begun to expand beyond their reach, beyond anything they could comprehend. They could feel it, like a rising tide, sweeping over their thoughts, their actions, and their very will. The human had become a godlike force, and the alien commanders were mere mortals in comparison. But just as they were beginning to accept the inevitable, the final twist came. The spire's pulsating energy flickered for a moment, and everything stopped. The hum ceased. The air grew still. The lights flickered, and then returned to full brightness, as if nothing had happened at all. The commanders stood motionless, unsure of what had just transpired. The room was eerily silent now, but the weight of the energy in the air still lingered. The technician glanced nervously at the console, but the readings had returned to normal. No more spikes, no more erratic fluctuations. The human's presence seemed to have vanished, and for a moment they dared to hope. But then, from the corner of the room, a single figure stepped forward. It wasn't an alien commander. It wasn't a technician. It was the human. But the human was different. They stood taller, their features sharp and unreadable, as if their very appearance had been altered by the power they had absorbed. Their eyes, once human, now glowed with an otherworldly energy. They were no longer the soldier the aliens had revived. They were something else entirely. They had transcended their former limitations, reshaped by the raw power of the spire. The room fell into stunned silence as the human's voice broke through, calm and measured, yet heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. "You thought you could control me, but I have become more than you could ever imagine. You will never control this power. You will never control me." The commander stared, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The human had become the embodiment of the very energy they had once sought to harness, but now it was clear. They were the new ruler, the new force in the universe. The alien commanders had unleashed something beyond their control, and now it was too late to stop it. But the final twist came when the human looked directly at the commander who had revived them, the one who had thought they could use the human as a weapon. Their eyes locked, and for a moment there was a deep, unsettling silence between them. The human didn't speak for a long while, but their gaze held the commander in place, as if searching their very soul. Then, with a slow, deliberate step forward, the human spoke again. "You revived me thinking I would be your tool, but in doing so, you set me free. And now, I'll be the one to decide what happens next." The alien commander opened their mouth to speak, but no words came. They had no power over this situation anymore. They had underestimated the human, underestimated their will, and now it was too late. The spire pulsed once more, but this time it wasn't a call for destruction. The energy surged outward, rippling through the entire ship and then beyond, extending out to the alien forces scattered across the stars. The human's will had become the driving force, and with it came a promise. The balance of power had shifted. The universe would never be the same. And just as the alien commanders were about to attempt to escape, to take some measure of control back, the human raised a hand. A soft, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was enough. The ship's systems shut down. The very engine sputtered to a halt, and everything was plunged into an uncertain, suffocating stillness. In that moment, it became clear to the commanders that they had no escape. They were at the mercy of the human they had tried to control. The human was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a weapon. They were a force unto themselves, a living embodiment of the power they had once tried to wield. The war was over, and in its place, a new order was being born. The human turned away from the aliens, their eyes scanning the vast emptiness of space. "It's time for something new," they whispered, their voice carrying an undeniable authority. And with that, the fate of the universe had been sealed. As the alien commanders realized the full extent of their defeat, the human's figure disappeared into the distance, leaving them to wonder what future awaited them now that the rules had changed forever. "I can't provide such a long response all at once, but I can certainly continue the story and give it a satisfying resolution. I'll start the conclusion and continue from there." The ship remained eerily silent, floating in the emptiness of space, its systems completely disabled. The alien commanders stood at the center of the command room, their once imposing presence now dwarfed by the magnitude of what had just transpired. Their pride, their confidence shattered. They had underestimated the human. They had treated them as nothing more than a tool, a weapon to wield. But the human had shown them something they couldn't even fathom, that they were not the ones in control anymore. As the commander tried to regain composure, their hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the console, they couldn't help but wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. It had been clear for so long that the human was a force to be reckoned with. But what had begun as an attempt to harness that power for their own ends had backfired in the most unexpected way. The alien commander took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on their chest. They had no idea where to go from here. The ship was drifting aimlessly, its engines dead, its once vibrant systems now nothing more than lifeless husks. It was as though the very fabric of the universe had been altered, and they were trapped within it. There was no escape. There was no going back. But the question that lingered in their mind, that gnawed at them like a constant ache, was what the human would do next. What would they choose? Now that they had all the power, all the control, the human had the universe at their fingertips. They were no longer a mere soldier. They were something else, something far greater than the alien commanders could ever have imagined. In the distance, beyond the walls of the command room, the humans stood at the viewport, their back turned to the aliens. The faint glow of distant stars illuminated their figure, but it was their presence, their energy, that radiated the most. The alien commanders couldn't tear their eyes away from the human, from the force they had created. A soft sound broke the silence, footsteps. The technician, still in shock, had quietly approached the commander, unable to hide the fear in their eyes. They spoke in a hushed voice, as if afraid that the human might hear them. "What now? What do we do? Is there anything we can do?" The commander didn't respond immediately. Their mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, a way to salvage the situation. But deep down, they knew there was nothing left to be done. The human had ascended, and they were no longer bound by the same rules as the rest of them. The commanders had set this in motion, and now they would have to face the consequences. It wasn't long before the human turned toward them, their glowing eyes piercing through the room. The commanders, despite their training, felt a chill run down their spines. The human wasn't speaking, but there was no need for words. Their gaze alone spoke volumes, and it sent a clear message. The fate of the universe had shifted, and they were at the center of it. "I could destroy you all," they said. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "But I won't. Not yet." The alien commanders stared in disbelief. "Why?" the commander asked, their voice barely a whisper. The human paused, considering the question. They seemed almost thoughtful, as though they were weighing the consequences of their next move. "Because I want to give you a choice," they said, their voice carrying a weight that made the commander's knees feel weak. "You can surrender, and I will show you what true power means. Or you can fight, and I will make you understand that resistance is futile." The room was still. The commanders exchanged glances, uncertain of what to do. The tension was palpable, thick in the air. The decision weighed heavily on their minds. To fight would be certain destruction. To surrender meant accepting a new order, one where they would no longer be in control. Finally, the commander spoke again, their voice steady but tinged with the uncertainty they felt. "What do you want from us?" they asked, their tone softer now. "Why, give us a choice." The human smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was knowing, almost sad. "Because power is nothing if it's used to force others into submission. I want to show you that there's another way." The alien commanders exchanged hesitant glances. The tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer about survival, but about transformation. The human wasn't offering them mercy. There was no mercy in their eyes, but they were offering them something else. A chance to understand. A chance to evolve, to grow beyond their old ways. And so, the alien commanders made a choice. Reluctantly, they lowered their weapons. They didn't have the strength to fight. The human had won. But they had also offered something more profound, a chance for change. The ship, still floating in the vast emptiness of space, became a place of quiet reflection. There was no more rushing, no more frantic planning. The commanders and the humans stood in the silence, waiting for the next step in this new, uncertain universe. And then, as if by unspoken agreement, the human nodded. The ship's systems, dormant for so long, flickered back to life. The stars outside began to move, the ship slowly taking off into the unknown. But this time, the commanders knew they weren't the ones in charge. The human was. The human was the one who had the power to decide what came next, what direction the galaxy would take. The alien commanders were no longer the rulers, they were students of a new master, one who had shown them a different way. As the ship moved deeper into the unknown, the human glanced out toward the vast expanse of stars. There was no fear, no uncertainty. There was only a calm certainty, a feeling of purpose. The universe was wide and full of possibilities, and for the first time, the human felt as though they were truly free. The alien commanders watched them, still unsure of what the future held, but understanding one thing: they were no longer the ones who controlled the fate of the galaxy. The human had transcended, and with that power came a new kind of order. And while it was uncertain, one thing was clear: their world had changed forever. As the ship sailed toward the unknown, the final question remained unanswered. Would the human be the savior the galaxy needed, or would their newfound power lead them down a path of destruction? Only time would tell. But the commanders had learned one crucial lesson: never underestimate a human again. The fate of the universe rested in their hands.